For analysis of the situation in Libya, I'm joined now by Professor Geoffrey Garrett. He's the Chief Executive of the US Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. And Professor Garrett, can I start by asking you, the US President Barack Obama says Washington is going to hand over control of this military operation within days, but how crucial is it that the US actually does that?
Well, I think critics would say it's crucial that the US stays in the lead de facto, even if they're not quote-unquote leading the coalition. Obviously, we've got a battle in the air above Libya. We've also got a battle in the west. Who's leading this operation? What is the mission? And also a battle, I think, increasingly inside the US. What is the US trying to do here? So the President's signal that he wants to get out of the lead role, I think, is consistent with a very much a sort of on the one hand, on the other hand Obama approach to Libya that many in the US now, they're calling him the great ditherer. He doesn't know whether he wants in or out on this one.
So what do you think the end game of this Libyan intervention is going to be?
That's the big problem. The realists in foreign policy would say, listen, you don't have an end game. It's unlikely that you'll be able to get Gaddafi out of power just by bombing from the air and using cruise missiles, but you've already said, the US has said, there are going to be no ground troops. So what happens if a bombing campaign leads to somewhat of a withdrawal from Gaddafi, but Gaddafi stays in power and then 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, attack some civilians again? What does the West do then? There's no end game is the realist critique. But on the other side, we have the liberal internationalism that says, listen, the West must do something here. Obama has to balance that, walk this very fine line between intervention and realism.
If George W. Bush was the decider, as I think he called himself, if Barack Obama is now being called the ditherer, are they also sending some confusing messages in the US because they say regime change is not part of the UN mandate, but they want Gaddafi gone? How confusing is that? Yeah,
it's really confusing. And I think if you look for historical precedents, you mentioned the decider, George Bush. Really, Obama looks to me like he's playing from a Bill Clinton script in the 1990s. You remember that Clinton didn't want to turn over Milosevic in Bosnia and Kosovo, but used again airstrikes where there wasn't going to be American battle deaths to take into account. For several years we had all that bloodshed in Bosnia, and I think that's what the critics would say of the US position today. You've got to be either in or out, and at the moment the US wants it both ways.
If you look at Barack Obama's foreign policy stance, he did double the number of US troops in Afghanistan. Now he's being called a ditherer. Is there some sort of Obama doctrine that is being shaped here?
The Obama doctrine up until now really has been more the realist one. Iraq was the wrong war. Afghanistan, yes, he wants to double down, but he also wants to get out of Afghanistan beginning in the middle of this year in 2011. Libya is a new challenge because it really, de facto the US is now in a third war. In an environment in which the US government has no money, the US military is stretched and exhausted, and American citizens are tired after a decade of war. So a new American commitment is really hard for the president to make, but he's under all this liberal pressure to do the right thing from a human rights standpoint.
Even if you think the US isn't fully committed to this conflict, nonetheless the perception would be that for the third time in a decade, the United States has gone into a Muslim nation.
Absolutely. And, that's clearly something that is playing on the president's mind and on the US government mind. I mean, what I think we see, at least at the leadership level, is that Hillary Clinton in the State Department has been more for the liberal intervention here. Robert Gates in the Defense Department has said, wait a second, this is really not part of our big strategy, which is to reduce American engagement. So the other factor we haven't talked about is that Obama really came very late to this. The call for action was led in Europe, not only by David Cameron in the UK, but also by Sarkozy in France. And so now we have something, on the one hand, the neocons from Bush would love the idea that Obama is in there now fighting for democracy and regime change. But on the other hand, I think they'd be rolling their eyes a little bit at the idea that Sarkozy is claiming that he's the leader of the Western coalition.
And Professor Garrett, if I can also ask you, do we know much about what sort of government or alternative these rebels might be able to form? I mean, is it possible that the West is going to be taken by surprise? Because I noticed the President's counter-terrorism advisor, John Brennan, was saying, look, Al-Qaeda loves a political vacuum, loves uncertainty. Libya won't be any different. Could the West actually be surprised with who ends up in power in Libya?
Of course. And again, that is the sort of cautious, realist concern. We're doing this intervention. You liberals are doing this intervention because you think it's the right thing. The problem is you're not hard-headed enough. You've got to think about the end game, and the end game is, do you get Gaddafi out? And if you get Gaddafi out, what or who replaces Gaddafi? You've got, the critics say you've got no strategy there, so you shouldn't do the intervention in the first place. But Obama, who was, I think, leaning that way 2 weeks ago, ultimately felt that this wave of democratic reform in the Arab world this year meant that he had to take some kind of a stand, and that's what we've seen. But it really is this delicate and maybe unsustainable balance, so something's going to have to give in the next little while, I would expect.
It's an intriguing dilemma. Professor Geoffrey Garrett from the US Studies Centre, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure, Kim.